This video is made possible by NordPass. Get a free month plus a special offer for you at nordpass.com/VisualPolitik. We'll tell you more about that in a moment. Almost tied with France, Germany is the country with the largest military budget in the entire European Union. According to data compiled by the World Bank, almost a quarter of all military spending in the countries that make up the European Community Club corresponds to the German armed forces. We're talking about the Bundeswehr, which literally translates as federal defense. VisualPolitik fans, Germany is one of the countries with the longest military tradition on the planet, which, as you all know, has not brought great joy to the history of mankind. But obviously, the situation today is completely different. The Bundeswehr was founded in 1955, 10 years after the fall of the Nazi regime and the end of World War II. During that time, the Allied Control Council that had controlled the country since the end of the First World War prohibited the country from having its own armed forces and dismantled and outlawed any military activity related to the former Wehrmacht, the armed forces of Nazi Germany. That was until 1955, when the ban was lifted and federal Germany founded the armed forces we know today. Of course, a lot has happened since then. Over almost 70 years, the German army has undergone at least 7 major reforms, both structural and strategic, from the first orientation based on the US military itself to the last 2 that have resulted in a huge downsizing. Check it out. Between the late 1980s and the mid-1990s alone, a period that coincides with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the Bundeswehr lost some 150,000 soldiers. And all in all, up until this point in time, the armed forces of West Germany, today's Germany, have been reduced in size by 60%. Of course, this need not be a bad thing. If there is one thing that characterizes modern armies, it is that, thanks to new technological capabilities, they need far fewer troops. The problem is that these technological capabilities require a lot of resources. And the question is, has this effort been made in Germany? Does the largest power in the European Union have well-equipped armed forces capable of carrying out complex deployments and missions? Are Germany's armed forces ready to go to war? Well, let's take a look. But before we go any further, do you keep track of how many usernames and passwords that you've created recently? Websites, applications, emails. I bet that you have a lot. And have you committed the cardinal sin of using the same password more than once? I know I did. Come on, I bet you've done that too. It is normal that due to time pressure or sheer laziness, we end up using simple or repeated passwords. But I have to tell you that this is something that we cannot afford to do. We cannot put our privacy at stake. With NordPass, you can automatically create secure passwords for each of your accounts and store them in one place without having to memorize them. But not only that, with NordPass, you can easily save and consult the details of your payment cards. So you can save time when paying online without having to have cards on hand. I use this autofill feature a lot. It is super useful. In addition, NordPass Premium, among its other features, also continuously scans the web in search of your data that may have been leaked, warning you in the event that your passwords are where they should not be. Best of all, NordPass has a special promotion for the VisualPolitik community, 1 month for free, plus a special offer for you at nordpass.com/VisualPolitik. Of course, if you change your mind, you also have a 30-day money-back guarantee.
Little regard for military affairs.
Germany is by far the leading economic power in Europe, and in terms of GDP, the 4th largest in the world, behind only the United States, China, and Japan. Hold on a moment. However, because despite its economic strength and public accounts that are among the healthiest in the old continent, Germany's defense effort accounts for not much more than 1% of its gross domestic product. And although spending began to increase after the Russian annexation of Crimea, under the leadership, incidentally, of the then defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen, it still remains well below the 2% that, as you know, NATO requires of its member countries. Well, this should not really be much of a concern to us either. Practically no NATO member meets this requirement. And after all, the defense of Europe is supposed to be carried out collectively. However, the problem that Germany has, and that many other countries also have, is that despite spending more than 50 billion euros every year, this figure goes almost entirely to salaries, disastrously planned structures, and a lot of current and bureaucratic expenses. And to top it all off, this lumbering bureaucracy and the endless contracting processes have caused the arrival of new equipment to be delayed for a long time, or simply to remain on standby. In other words, the problem in Germany is not only that only a little more than 1% of its GDP is allocated to defense, but above all, that most of this money goes to fatten inefficient structures that have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with operational capabilities. To be graphic, and without wishing to offend anyone, a substantial part of the money goes to pay the salaries of men in their 50s and older, in many cases with bulging beer bellies, whose job is to spend their day-to-day at an office desk. And well, let's just say that's not the prototype of what we all understand as an operational army. So, of course, in the German case, one should not so much talk about the lack of effort in defense as, above all, about the poor investment and planning of the armed forces. After all, 50 billion euros is not exactly small change. It is far more money than South Korea spends on defense each year, almost double what Australia spends and more than double Israel's budget. And yes, I know Germany is much, much bigger than Israel or South Korea, but here we are mainly talking about operational capabilities. And as you will see, Germany is far behind these two countries. And the problem is largely to do with this chart. Look at it. Only 18% of German military expenditure is spent on military equipment. This is also below the NATO minimum of 20%. And the fact is that precisely because of their historical past, German politicians have always been reluctant to buy weapons. What's more, defense spending is not an electoral trump card in German society either. According to a 2017 poll, just 9% of Germans considered it important to increase defense spending, compared to 91% who considered it irrelevant, inadequate, or had no opinion. Since the post-war period, Germany's position has been based on soft diplomacy as its major foreign policy gamble, a stance that, as has been demonstrated with Ukraine, can have shortfalls. But anyway, the point is that this lack of spending on military equipment has made Germany extremely NATO dependent, or rather, US dependent, for everything to do with military matters. After all, Germany is, after Japan, the country in the world with the second highest number of US military installations. And as curious as it may seem to you, the American giant has many more US soldiers stationed in this territory than, for example, in South Korea, a country that, if you remember, is still technically at war. We're talking about a total of more than 35,000 troops. In short, poor planning, lack of spending on equipment, and dependence on the United States have resulted in extreme sloppiness, leaving the Bundeswehr in a deplorable state. And no, we are not exaggerating in the least.
No matter where you look, there's dysfunction. High-ranking German officer at the Bundeswehr HQ.
Faced with such a mess, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, German politicians suddenly seem to have realized that war in Europe is not completely out of the question, or at least that European deterrence does not count for much today. This is a situation that has simply taken the Berlin leadership by surprise. And the truth is that today, if the Bundeswehr had to enter into combat, it is possible that it would barely be able to withstand a few days of war. And it's not only us saying this. Take a look.
The happy-go-lucky German, surrounded by friends with a rising standard of living, not worried about security. If there is a problem, the Americans will take care of it. That's a thing of the past. Erkhard Broz, president of the Federal Academy for Security Policy. Germans lulled themselves into a false sense of security, into this belief that there would never be another war in Europe. The upshot is that over 2 generations we forgot how to defend ourselves. Armin Paperger, the chief executive of the arms manufacturer Rheinmetall.
Well, to remedy this long military decline, which we will discuss in details in a moment, the new Scholz government announced a historically extraordinary budget to modernize the armed forces. I'm sure most of you remember this news story.
Germany to boost military spending in latest historic shift. Germany will channel 100 billion euros this year into a fund to modernize the military.
In addition, the Scholz government has also committed to reaching 2% of GDP in annual military spending by 2024. So, the question is, how difficult a task does Germany really have ahead of it to bring its armed forces up to date? What have been the effects of so much neglect in defense? What should Germany's priorities be when it comes to investing all that money in the coming years? Well then, let's take a look.
An army in ruins.
The once feared German army is now little more than a bunch of tanks, planes, helicopters, and submarines that, in many cases, cannot even shoot, fly, or sail. And keep in mind, these were basically the conclusions of the Social Democrat Hans-Peter Bartels, former commissioner for the armed forces of the Bundestag, the German parliament, after conducting an extensive report in 2019 on the country's military capabilities. His report was full of devastating conclusions. The report served to illustrate an uncomfortable reality for the government. The German army even lacks sufficient critical equipment, such as bulletproof vests, night vision equipment, transport helicopters, and radios for secure communications. And the shortage is not an exception, but structural. So much so that, to give you an example, on a visit by US officials to Lithuania, they were dismayed to see that Bundeswehr personnel were communicating with insecure cell phones because they did not have enough encrypted military radios.
There was no one German soldier who was familiar with the radio system used there, or had been instructed on how to use it. When it comes to the equipment available, the international exercises, the Bundeswehr is regularly the weakest link in the chain. German Parliament report.
And this is not all. Of all the military equipment Germany has in its inventories, only a small fraction is ready for deployment. And then a lot of the equipment they have in place has not lived up to the expectations when it comes to operations. The list of disappointments in the German inventory is long. Very, very long. For example, we've got the case of the F-125 class frigate Baden-Württemberg. This is from a new class of frigates, of which the German government purchased 4 units in 2007, and which, after years of delays and huge cost overruns, were delivered to the Navy overweight and with many operational limitations compared to the original plan. This has made it impossible for the frigates to fulfill the function for which they were designed. They even had to be returned to the manufacturer after delivery for modifications, something that has never happened before in the history of Germany.
The German Navy decided to return their bloated new frigate to the ship store this Christmas.
Wait, because there is much more. For example, a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers participating in a NATO exercise in Norway found itself short of night vision goggles and MG3 machine guns. And, well, the result was as funny as it was embarrassing.
Germany's army is so under-equipped that it used broomsticks instead of machine guns.
In a NATO exercise. Crazy. The most unfortunate part of this story is that in order to participate in the exercise, they had to borrow more than 14,300 pieces of equipment from 56 different units of the Bundeswehr, and even by doing that, they still fell short. And of course, this is not an exception. It is the playbook in any branch of the military, be it land, sea, or air. But do you want another example? Only 9 of its 51 Tiger attack helicopters and less than 30% of its Eurofighter and Tornado fighters could fly at the end of 2018. The reason? The lack of maintenance and spare parts available in the armed forces stocks means that the already scarce equipment has ended up in storage, as if it were a kind of inoperative reserve. So much so that the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, has even seen the resignation of pilots who have left in frustration because they simply could not fly.
German pilots aren't getting enough flight time. The problem is that the Luftwaffe does not have enough flyable planes for its pilots to fly.
Can anybody tell me what pilots who can't fly are good for? And it keeps going because it's a similar story with the Leopard 2 tanks, the crown jewel of the German heavy infantry, and only half of which are operational. What's more, only 150 of the 350 Puma armoured vehicles are ready for use. Of the 15 A400M transport aircraft, only 3 were airworthy in 2018, and there was a season when not a single one of the 6 German submarines could sail. Do you understand now why Germany has sent almost no equipment to Ukraine to support their resistance against the Russian invasion? If they barely have any functional equipment for themselves, how can they give it away to another country? Well, that's beside the fact that they don't seem to like it much either, to tell you the truth.
In the short term, we have nothing available that we can supply really quickly and promptly. Annela Baerbock, German Foreign Minister.
The fact is that apart from this, all these shortcomings also entail a clear lack of training and preparation of the troops, something that, of course, would greatly affect their morale in the case of combat. The flying time of Luftwaffe pilots is just one example, but if we look at the recruitment figures, it becomes even clearer.
German army struggles to attract much-needed recruits. Number of new soldiers fell last year to an all-time low of 20,000.
Now, think about it for a moment. With this kind of situation, who is going to be motivated to join the armed forces? Well, the question that many of you are probably asking yourselves at this point is, but is there a solution to all this mess? Is 100 billion extra budget enough to rebuild a military that is in tatters? What should Germany spend all that money on? Well, let's find out.
A lesson learned?
With all that we've just told you, I'm sure that most of you get the picture. The German armed forces are obsolete. And not only obsolete, but in many cases, in an almost decrepit state. And this, despite spending more than 50 billion euros every year on defense. Crazy. Well, this is precisely what explains the apparent and historic paradigm shift that Germany seems to want to give to its defense policy. That, and also the 100 billion euros that they have approved to rebuild their armed forces, which, by the way, over the course of the next 5 years, if we add current spending, will mean meeting the 2% of GDP military spending commitment required by NATO. The question is, what should they spend all this money on? What will Berlin's shopping list be with an amount of money that is practically equivalent to everything that an economy like Ecuador produces in a year? Well, the truth is that, for now, the shopping list for the German defense is practically a secret. However, there are several clues and several guesses we can make about which equipment will, or should be, among the next German acquisitions. So far, what Germany has made public is that it will buy 35 fifth-generation F-35 fighters, considered the most advanced fighter in the world, to replace its old Tornadoes, in order to have air superiority in the event of a conflict along with nuclear capabilities. They will also acquire 15 Eurofighters with electronic warfare capabilities and armed drones, equipment that, in some cases, was announced before launching the special fund. In total, Germany expects to spend about 41 billion of that 100 billion euros on the Air Force, and about 19 billion on the Navy, with which they expected to acquire submarines, frigates, and corvettes, as well as multi-purpose combat ships. A further 17 billion in equipment, which will be used almost entirely to upgrade and make operational the German army's existing armor, tanks, and artillery, and of course the last fundamental area that Germany is seeking to address with this enormous amount of resources is the lack of basic equipment supplies. For example, according to Eileen Malta, a security expert at the German Council on Foreign Relations, almost 21 billion will be spent on both new communications technologies, such as secure radios and cybersecurity, and on soldiers' own personal equipment. The question is, will all this be enough? Probably not. As you have already seen, the state of the Bundeswehr is complicated. Very complicated. But it will undoubtedly mark a turning point for the German army, which will have to be accompanied by a restructuring of spending to eliminate all the zombie military structures that consume a lot of resources but are not operational. Structures that are to blame for the fact that the money has not gone to military technology and maintenance but to other areas. And VisualPolitik fans, this task is much more important than simply spending more and reaching 2% of GDP, which is, for instance, what Greece is doing. The question is, are German politicians willing to do all this? In the end, the armed forces are usually one of the largest employers in almost any country, and there is often great resistance. And that's without getting into how difficult it is to overcome old vices. Take a look.
Germany accused of making stealth defense cuts. The German defense budget will be in decline once the impact of the special 100 billion euro fund is stripped out, according to official documents cited by newspaper Bild. Critics say the one-off fund is obscuring cuts to day-to-day spending.
Did you know that the German armed forces were in such a deplorable state? Do you think that the solution is to put in more money? Or do you think that 50 billion euros a year is enough? And the problem is how the funds have been spent? Leave us your opinions here below in the comments. And if you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel by clicking on the little bell so you don't miss any other news. Once again, thank you very much for being here. All the best, and I'll see you next time.